about, as I say, the young boys, the older boys. The ages of the people going to school at that time was age 4 through 18. And of course today we think preschool is a very new thing, or post-high school, going beyond 17. If we look at the part of the desk, we can see the old inkwell. I started teaching in 1951 in Saxonville. We still made our ink down in the basement. And you would pour it into the well with a gooseneck pitcher. And then they would, in the early days, they used a pen such as this. This is a goose feather or a turkey feather. This particular one is a turkey feather, which we got years ago from the Donovan Turkey Farm. And when you need a new nib, a new point, most people carried a little knife, and it was smaller than a jackknife. And I carried one for years, and I knew the name of it, but I never knew the reason. It was called a pen knife. And it's a very tiny knife, and most people had it so they could make a new nib or a new point on it. We went from the goose or turkey feather into this style of pen, and this is what we used when we first started to write, and the point would be put down in the bottom here, like such as that, and you would dip into the inkwell and you'd write. Many times the ink would run off it. So then I would today, when the children come through, I would ask the children if they had a pen, and of course they all have ballpoint pens, and we talk about how easy it is to put it in your pocket and they don't run, and how clever they were at that time. The type of teaching that they used for the young children was called parroting. The teacher would say 2 plus 2 is 4, and the children would answer 2 plus 2 is 4. Paper was very expensive, so they used slate. They could hold it up, they could turn it over, they could show the teacher the work. It was easy to wipe off. If you look, you can see the actual blackboard and the chalk tray. And if you went around the whole room here, you would see that they're still on the walls. If you study the floor, you would see where the screws held the furniture right down. The screw holes are still in the floor. The maps at that time, if you look at this one, you'll notice that the printing is very, very tiny, not much color to it, and of course we have to remember the lighting in those days wasn't very good either. I asked the children to compare that to their maps today, which are beautiful. Very colorful, large print, easy to follow. You'll notice that we have one large music book, and we show them again, we point out to them that texts were very expensive, and so that if they could use one text for the whole class, that would be good. Many times in the regular public schools, they would have 3 or 4 grades in one room. So you'd have one row of the first grade, the second, third, and fourth. It was nothing. When I first started teaching in '51 in Saxonville, we had close to 40 children, split 5th and 6th grade. Today, we would be shocked at that, because we say, you know, we should be able to get at individual attention. How much individual attention they could give is pretty interesting. Many of the instruments that you see on the teacher's desk indicate the old pencil sharpener, the school bell, because they would leave this building for recess and go across onto the common, the old globes. So education in those days, especially for this building, would be very expensive. And later on, we're going to talk about the Civil War and General Gordon, and he was one of the graduates from this building. In relation to the Civil War, we had just mentioned how General Gordon had graduated from this academy. Framingham had a very great part in participating, not only with the number of men who volunteered and went into the Civil War, but also in making blankets at the Saxonville carpet, the Mills and Roxbury carpet area, that they made blankets and uniforms for the soldiers from the North. We show in here the uniform. We show a picture of the factory itself at that time. We show a picture of Mr. Simpson, who had owned the factory at that time too. As we move over into the next case, You can see the caps, you can see some of the weapons in the bottom of the case, the powder horn. You can look into it and see how they made their own little balls, their own little shell to shoot out of the musket. A very interesting point in the case is a picture of Lathrop White, who during one of the battles got shot, and the button on his uniform saved his life. And we have the button right in the case here showing that. The difference between the musket that you see in our case and the muskets that you see downstairs in the 16 and 1700s, we move up. Remember, a musket is a smooth barrel. It doesn't have any cuts or grooves in it. And the men at that time would have to stand the musket up. During the Civil War, in the Revolutionary War, they had to pour powder down. They had to take the ramrod out from the bottom of the barrel, drop in the ball, ram either paper or cloth down into it, take the ramrod out. If you forgot to take the ramrod out and shot it out of the barrel, you couldn't reload. And of course, many battlefields would be loaded with those out front because of how nervous the soldiers were during battle. But anyhow, put the ramrod back in. Downstairs, they had to take the cap off the powder pan, put powder on that, and then when they were ready to fire, and when they fired, it would spark the powder in the powder pan, go into the touch hole, and then drive the ball out. In the Civil War, they didn't have the powder pan on the side. They had a cap. They didn't have to carry their powder on a powder holder. They had a little package, and the package was all wrapped in paper, and they would bite that off. They would pour inside it, they'd pour the powder down, the ball was already inside that, and they would use that paper to ram it down. Again, they had to remember to take the ramrod out. And then they put a cap on, and now they're ready to fire. So between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, the interesting thing was who got there first with the most. And you would have a line of men kneeling and a line of men standing. And during the battle, an awful lot of noise. The officer had to be up front, and he would usually drop his sword to fire. And you picture maybe 300 or 400 people all lined up, and as the lines move up and the people moving toward their enemy were not allowed to fire again until they got very close. Even the ones at the back of the parapets waiting for the enemy to come up. And I point out to the children, if you picture the Revolutionary War soldiers on the top of Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill, and the British coming up, and the British could just march up with their weapons like this. When they get up close enough, remember now, this ball that would come out is smaller than the barrel. When they fired, it would hit the barrel going all the way down, pop, 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 pop. And then where it came out, that's the direction it would go. And they had no idea where it would go. So when an officer said, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes, he meant you had to be that close to be able to hit someone. But still, picture it now. You have all these people lined up, ready to shoot. You have all the British coming up in lines, beautiful lines, and then the officer gives the signal to fire, and it goes, whoosh, and you see a whole line of men fall. And you see them fall back. Now, that line turns around to reload, the other line stands, the ones that are kneeling. The men turn around, they start loading again. The British come up with their second line. Again, the officer says, fire. And you see the whole line of British fall again, and they may fall back again. Interesting point. A good rifleman in those days could load and fire 3 times in a minute, which is very, very fast. I think to myself, if I were the British soldier and I had been up there twice, and the officer says to me, let's line up again, boys, we're going up, I don't know if I could have the courage to go back up into that flaming fire that came out from the top. At that time, of course, during the battle, the Americans run out of ammunition, and they're now throwing stones, they're clubbing them, and the British win the top of the Bunker Hill, but they lose so many men. When we talk about the Civil War, later on, they do have rifles, meaning they have grooves cut in the barrel called rifling. And now when you send out a cased shell, you could fire the cased shell and it would come out straight because it was given direction by the grooves. They had these weapons in the Civil War, but the old-timers who bought the weapons and so forth didn't like the changes, so they stayed with this. This is a period of time when Gatling comes out with his machine gun, or they have the coffee mill grinder gun. This is the time of landmines that they come out with torpedoes. They come out using balloons at that period of time to observe the enemy and so forth. Very interesting period. I have the 13th Mass Volunteers handwritten account for the Civil War, and many of the men from that district came from Framingham. The book was given to me by Dr. Slade. It was found in his attic on Concord Street. I brought the history of this company, and in the book they'd say so-and-so died at a certain time, but they didn't know, and it was in the book that I had. So when they were writing the history of the 13th Mass Volunteers, they didn't have that book. We're going to go around and look at General Gordon's saddle. These are the gifts from the Gordon family. We're mentioning to you very well-known, very brilliant general of the Civil War, General George H. Gordon, and he was with the 2nd Massachusetts Regiment. We also see his chest that he would carry around. This was used during the Civil War all the time that he had served. Remember, I pointed out to you several times now that he was a graduate of this academy. This is a side saddle belonging to his wife. And we show that how she would get on the saddle in this manner. She would sit on sideways, and then she would put her left leg over this, like this big horn here, and then the dress would drape out over it. And of course, then they would ride along, hoping that everyone could see them, how lovely they look going down the road, maybe on a Sunday afternoon. A famous family name in Framingham is Nixon. We have Nixon Road. This is a picture of Warren Nixon, who was an early calligrapher, cartographer, talking about map making, a great surveyor. We have his tools here. We also have his personal notebooks with his notes in relation to his work. If you recall, we started with the Framingham Center and the stagecoaches, and we talked about how the railroad wanted to build here at the center, but the stagecoach owners forced them downtown. This is a great model made by Steve Herring of the downtown railroad station. This isn't the original station. There was one prior to this. But one of the great features were the bullseye windows, and we have an example of that right here, handmade and then put flat and then cut off, which gives you that nice bullseye effect beautifully. Antique dealers just love those. They're big collector's items. The railroad, very important to industry in Framingham in the early period, not only with our straw industry and later on with General Motors coming into being and so forth. But you'll notice in front of the railroad depot, you'll see a streetcar. And we're talking about transportation for people all around town. All the small villages, Saxonville, Knobscott, which used to be called on the old maps New Boston. Any area in town, if people wanted to get around, prior to the streetcars, they had to have their own horse or they did their own walking. First of all, they had streetcars pulled by horses, and then of course they went into the electric. If you go down Union Avenue to where Bowditch Field is and take a left onto Mount Waite, Perini has in the back there near our old incinerators, there used to be the big power station for the streetcars. The streetcars ran from Knobscott downtown. They ran from Natick to Framingham. They ran from downtown Framingham to Saxonville. They went over to Ashland. They went to Holliston. You could go all the way into Boston, going up to Route 9 at the center. And there was a big station there, a big building, and you'd get on there and you would go all the way down what we now call as Route 9 into Boston. On the early maps, so you'll notice that was called Eastern Avenue, Western Avenue where General Motors was. So it's very interesting looking at old maps and seeing what the streets were called earlier. If you wanted to go to Worcester, Then you went up to the center. You got a streetcar at the center. It went up as far as White's Corner, where the restaurant